Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Royal Society of Medicine. Now, you all know what is going on around us today, obviously. And so, first of all, can I ask us all please to be upstanding? And we'll observe a minute's silence for Her Majesty the Queen. Thank you. So, welcome again to the Royal Society of Medicine, our series In Conversation, which some of you have been watching for reasons that have escaped me, but online for the last 2 years. And it's good. This is not the first one we've done live, but it's one of the first ones, and the first one we've done completely with in this venue. It has been recorded, but we're not going to show it for a couple of weeks, and we'll explain why later on. Well, I'm not going to do that, but it will be there like all the others. But it is much better to be like this, isn't it? I mean, it is. I mean, it really is. There's no doubt about it. Okay. Now then. So, and I'm Simon Wesley. I'm the ex-president of the RSM, and myself and Roger set this series up in the grim days, the old days. Now then, what I dislike is when chairs say, tonight our guest needs no introduction, and immediately gives a very long introduction. So, this guest needs very little introduction, incredibly little. It is obviously Julia Gillard, and who is president, oh my God. I wish you had been. You'd have done a better job. Who is Prime Minister of Australia between 2010 and 2013, the 27th Prime Minister of Australia, but the only one, and still the only one, who was a woman. And does this happen all the time? It's going to take hours. It really is, yeah. And now I'd like to say that her career, however, only really got going in 2018 when she came to King's College London, where she's chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. I would have to say that because I'm the dean there. So I would obviously think that. But no, that even I would have to admit that is also eclipsed by her most recent post when last year you became chair of the Wellcome Trust in 2021, of which much more anon. Now, for most of the time when we've done these In Conversations during COVID, whoever it is we're talking to, politician, journalist, anybody, it doesn't really matter, we start with something on COVID because that was the story of the day. We've had a few breaks, but we still had, we had to go back when we had Nick Robinson here the day before Boris resigned. We had to deal with that and so on. But today there is still one subject that we're going to have, we should, and it's appropriate that we begin with. So this is obviously an extraordinary week in the history of the UK and the Commonwealth, and I know we're going to talk some politics, but not much Australian politics, a little bit, but not much. But nevertheless, I'm pretty sure and you made a beautiful tribute to the Queen when you arrived back here off the plane, but you must have met her quite a lot, I would have thought. It kind of goes with the job, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Does she drink a lot?
Not in my presence, okay. So I'm not sure what to make of that. Hopefully I wasn't driving her to drink. Okay. But I did see her, from time to time, but most intensively when she came to Australia because we were hosting the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Perth. So I was the chair in office for that meeting. And she took the opportunity to travel around Australia extensively. I mean, what was unsaid at any point during the visit was that I think she knew and everybody else knew it would be the last time she would come to Australia, but it was never bannered as the last visit. But she did set up a home in Canberra with our Governor-General in the Governor-General's residence, and she did visit every Australian state. So that's quite a lot to do in a very big country, and was received by huge crowds of well-wishers wherever she went. One of my abiding memories of her is when we had the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, there's an official sort of public-facing ceremony to kick it all off, and the end point of the ceremony is that each leader of the 54 countries is introduced and walks across the stage and people applaud and all the rest of it. And then the last two people to come out were going to be me and then the Queen. And so 54 people coming out, you know, here's X from Y Nation, yay! Here's, you know, the next one, yay! It actually takes a long time. And so we were standing in a corridor off stage with us at the end of the 50-odd people who were going in front and moving sort of very slowly forward as someone went across the stage. And I said to her at one point, Her Majesty, can I get someone to get you a chair because this is going to take a long time and you could be seated? And she said, no, I'm fine. I'm like, damn, I wouldn't have minded a chair, but now now it's really going to look weak if I ask for one. So no, we stood and kept going forward until it was our moment on the stage.
And it said that she's incredibly well informed, or was incredibly well informed about matters all around the world, and particularly Australia. Did that come over when you were talking to her?
Oh yes, I mean she certainly, you know, we were pursuing, and a number of like-minded countries were pursuing some reform proposals for the Commonwealth at that meeting, and she was very well informed about those, and a lot of her energy obviously went into keeping the Commonwealth, keeping a dialogue across Commonwealth countries. And, you know, she could reflect back on history. So you would have conversations. I mean, we all talk about, you know, what about X and Y when it happened? You know, do you remember when, you know, the men went to the moon or something like that? You know, we all have those conversations, but almost inevitably, if you had a conversation like that with her, she will have met the people involved. So that, you know, to have had that lifespan and to have, you know, known people famously, you know, Prime Minister Winston Churchill forward, but not just British leaders, but leaders around the world over so many decades. I mean, there's, you know, we're not going to see the likes of that again.
No. When we listen to a whole generation of Australian politicians paying tribute to the Queen, I don't know, it was impossible, they have different views on the monarchy and its future, but you couldn't tell that from what they were saying. It was incredible. It was extraordinarily warm.
Yeah, I think sometimes here in the British media, it's the issue about whether Australia should become a republic is framed around how popular are members of the royal family in Australia, and I think that's the wrong frame to look at it. I think it's well and truly possible, and you will have seen this in recent days, for people to very much respect individuals in the royal family, and certainly the Queen, very deeply respected, and still believe that Australia should become a republic. So this sense that, you know, if the royals are popular, Australia or indeed other Commonwealth countries, realm countries that still have the monarch as their head of state, that's a function of popularity, I think is just a misreading of the situation. Mm-hmm. I'm sure over time that Australia will move to becoming a republic, but even when it does, you know, people will be interested in the royal family. If members of the royal family come on tour, they will be warmly received. It's not about that. It's really about, you know, us and our constitutional arrangements and how we define that for ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, Malcolm Turnbull, same college as me, he was tearing up, which I've never seen. Didn't know he could, but anyway, but he was. He was, okay. So let's, I mean, there's several things that we're going to break for questions and things like that. There's several things, and obviously one of the things you're very, very famous for in all sorts of ways is, we're going to call it the speech, okay? But I was going to jump in. I told you I would start with that, but I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind because it's like greatest hits, you know, when you go to the Rolling Stones or something like that, you know. You've got to work up to it a bit. So if we could just go back a little bit before and sketch in some of the background. So I want to talk a little bit about what life was like for you before, as you were moving up to the 2010 campaign as a politician in Australia, and how that worked for you. And we'll think about how much it changed and how much your speech changed it. But and starting with one of my friends out there, who's a massive fan of you, massive fan, said, and I said, and what he said was that that you were often portrayed as cold and unknown, etc. And he said, you are warm, engaging, thoughtful, and considerate, and always were. So I want to say, how do you think that reputation developed in that period?
Well, I probably didn't see it like this at the time, but in the years since, you know, one of the things that I've wanted to do coming out of that experience of leadership is to delve into the question, you know, how much of what happened is about me and choices I made and political choices I made, how much of it was about the sort of temper of the times in Australia in that era, and how much of it is explained by gender and can teach us lessons about overcoming sexist barriers for women in leadership. And you know, this is very hard to disaggregate because you never get to run the kind of control test where you can watch a male political career in exactly the same political circumstances with exactly the same decisions. So you know, there's judgment involved in it. But as, you know, I've looked more at the research base, as we've deepened the research base at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College, it's very apparent, and the psychological research is now very deep, that each of us has gendered sexist stereotypes whispering in the back of our brains. And so if we see a man who is commanding and leading, that flows easily with our stereotypes of what men should be like. If we see a woman who is commanding and leading, we easily think that that offends against the stereotype of being nurturing and empathetic, putting team and family in front of self. And so we very quickly conclude that a woman with power is actually an unlikable woman. You know, very hard-boiled, very tough, likely to have pushed a lot of people over to have got to where she's got to. She's probably a bit of a, and I won't use the word that normally lies in that sentence, but you know the one I'm thinking of. And if we're all painfully and reflectively honest, there will be moments in our lives where we've either said or thought those things, looking at the TV or maybe looking at a senior leader in our workplace. And so, you know, I think for me, those stereotypes very much came to the fore, and they easily come to the fore in politics because at the end of the day, politics and political leadership, getting to political leadership is not for the faint-hearted. You know, it's inherently in our democratic systems, UK, Australia, it is inherently a competition. You know, you go for pre-selection in your political party, other people go for pre-selection, someone wins, someone loses. You run in a seat, or for the Senate in Australia, someone wins, someone loses. You have the election and one team wins and the other team loses. You have the competition within your political party as to who's going to come through for ministries and more senior ministries, and ultimately a la Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, who comes through for leadership. You know, these are hard-fought competitions, and so I think the frame of unlikable, cold, robotic easily goes around women leaders. And if you look across the contemporary sweep of British politics, I think you can see that at play in how Theresa May was characterised. And I think certainly in the early days of her leadership campaign against Rishi Sunak, it was a frame that was also starting to be put around Liz Truss. And it remains to be seen when we move out of this, you know, quite extraordinary period, which is obviously about mourning the loss of the Queen, and we go back to the rhythm of politics as usual, how much that frame will be put around her.
Yeah. And you said at the start of the 2010 campaign that you said the public needed to see the real you. It's a quote you made, and I can't remember if it was him anyway. And how, and was that a conscious, well, obviously it was a conscious decision. That was a stupid question, wasn't it? But what made you decide to do that, to start to challenge? Because you'd had some rough times in the campaigns before, I think. What made you decide to kind of change tack, as it were?
I think, we had a lot of, going back to 2010, there are obviously a lot of difficulties for me and the government and my political party in the lead up to the 2010 campaign. The leadership changed from me to Kevin Rudd. There were a number of very big issues, what we were going to do about health funding, what we were going to do about a mining tax, that needed to be, what we were going to do about climate change, which needed to be resolved. And so we had a lot of internal turbulence and external difficulties during the campaign, which made it quite difficult to be received, through the sort of chaos of it all, be received on what you were trying to put before the people. More than that statement, what I'd sort of point to in the 2010 campaign is we made steadied politically when I was able to get out there and to focus very, very solidly on policy, and we particularly focused on education policy and what would equalise opportunities for children from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Okay. And on the day you were elected, I just want to quote the Sydney Morning Herald, and they said, after 4 blokes called John, 2 called William, a conga line to include Arthur, Andrew and Alfred, we now have a Julia.
Yeah.
And then they went on to say, but it's more than just an inspirational role. Having a woman running the country will challenge our collective notions of what it means to be Australian, to be a leader, and to be a woman. They write quite well at this. Yep. They do, don't they? They do. And so tell us then how that happened. So how did you start by did you challenge those notions, or was change coming, or?
Oh, I think it's more organic than that. Right. When I became Prime Minister, I didn't have to wander around saying, oh, I'm the first woman to do the job. Like, it's just so, obvious. And, because it's obvious, because it disturbed patterns of previous role models, there's no doubt that women and girls, latched onto it and looked at it, and it was, shared. When I was Minister for Education, I used to go to a lot of schools. Once I became Prime Minister, I continued to go to a lot of schools, and I would have young girls run up to me telling me how they wanted to be Prime Minister. And I think the role modelling effect did have an impact. A friend of mine actually joked that her 7-year-old son had watched something on the TV and had picked up something about politics, and they'd had one of those conversations he had with a child where you're trying to take a quite complex political problem and put it in child speak. And so she did that, my friend, and concluded it by saying, oh, if you're really interested in things like this, you could be Prime Minister one day. To which he said, with all the certainty of a 7-year-old, no, you need to be a girl to do that. So, role modelling really does matter. So that was happening. But what was also happening was, and it was less perceptible at the start, but it got clearer over time that the critiques and the way I was being received was very much through the prism of gender. So, a ridiculous focus on what I was wearing. Astronomical. Hard to hit a news story that was about policy, because you had to get through those several pages that were about what I was wearing. Just a sense from the press gallery that they'd stand in a little closer, that they'd ask a question a little harder. There was just a sort of dynamic that had changed. And that over time, as the longer you govern, you make tough decisions. Some people like them, some people don't. Inevitably, there's some choppy water. The more we got into that choppy water, then the more, gendered the critiques became. And it was, easy for people to paint me as, I don't have children, so, you know, out of touch. What does she know about family life? You know, brackets, undertone. What sort of woman decides not to have children, in brackets? You know, the fact she doesn't have children, doesn't have a family, shows how ambitious she's been, how ruthless she's been, how determined she's been to get there. You know, and that it's therefore about her self-aggrandisement, not about, you know, what she believes in or doing things for the Australian community. So that was very much conjured with in the political dialogue, both by the opposition, by the media, and by some of the community protest elements.
There was a strange business with a fruit bowl.
Oh, that was way earlier.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah, much earlier, where when Labor was in opposition, and I rushed back from overseas when Labor was having a sort of leadership crisis, and I turned back up at my home, did an interview, was photographed in my kitchen, and there was a decorative glass bowl, which is actually not a fruit bowl because the design is on the bottom. But anyway, it got reported as, you know, how strange and unnatural that someone would be sitting in a kitchen with a bowl without fruit in it. So, yeah, that did happen.
That did happen, yeah, okay, it really did.
It really did, it really did.
My God, okay. So, anyway, so now the reason we've asked you, we've been fortunate because you were going to come 2 years ago and then something happened. I don't know
yes.
what, something happened. Anyway, is that this is we're coming up to the 10th anniversary of what I have to say is, you know, one of your big things, the speech you gave. And I'm just going to read out from the press just 2 weeks ago in Australia, and it said, as former Prime Minister Julia Gillard's first words landed inside the chamber on October the 9th, 2012, so we're almost there, not many of her opponents and peers could have known they're about to be part of one of the most iconic moments in Australian history. And I believe it's also the favourite TV moment. Yeah. Do you know what our British favourite TV moment is, by the way?
No.
No, it's Blackadder, the last episode.
All right.
We're obsessed with the first
I think that's it's a pity that it's not something from Yes Minister, because
yes,
that's such a wonderful British export. Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah.
But no, it isn't. It's Blackadder. So we get on to that. Now we will put in the link to the recording of this. We will put a link to the speech and to the transcript. We're not going to play it now because, you know, we're not going to do that. But it's there, and most of you have seen. If you haven't seen it, you better had. You can find it straight away. Just put in YouTube, and then you're there. But tell us about the build-up to that. I mean, one of my friends in Australia says, I really want to know, did she prepare it?
No.
Oh, you didn't?
No.
You did.
So I have to just backtrack a little bit. We in Australia would say British politicians and British Prime Ministers kind of work part-time because you've got this, you know, wonderful parliamentary question thing where the Prime Minister only comes to question time every so often, and ministers are only in the firing line every so often in question time. In Australia, we've taken that form, question time, but we've sort of weaponised it. And so when Parliament sits, which it, you know, does 18, 19, 20 weeks a year, 4 days a week, there's a question time every day. The Prime Minister needs to be overseas at a high level, you know, event like the G20 or in hospital to not attend question time. There is no other excuse. And you go every day, and overwhelmingly it's the Prime Minister who takes most of the questions. And so, yeah, it's very ritualised, this hard-hitting question time every day. And I was using my normal rhythm of getting ready for question time on that day. And because of surrounding political events, I knew that the theme of the day was likely to be about sexism in politics, because the person I and the government had supported to be Speaker had been revealed to have sent some very sexist text messages. Now, whilst we couldn't have known that at the time that we supported him to be Speaker, it was obviously going to be, you know, stylised as having supported a sexist for the role of Speaker. And so I was getting ready for that, getting ready for question time. But when we got in there, the opposition used a parliamentary mechanism to get straight to a debate. So I didn't know that I was going to be giving a speech until they used that mechanism, and then Tony Abbott spoke first and I spoke second. So what you see is me using some of Tony Abbott's statements, which I'd taken in because I was going to rely on them in question time when asked, and then I just made some handwritten notes, just a sort of spine, a dot point for the speech, and gave it off that.
Have you still got those notes?
Yes, and they're actually the original edition of my memoir, My Story. The inside wash of the front cover is the notes, but I've got dreadful writing. I mean, really, seriously dreadful writing. Even very common for me to come out of my office when I was Prime Minister to find 5 or 6 staff in a huddle, and you'd think, oh, there's a crisis afoot, and then you'd realise that they're all bent over a note that I'd sent and none of them could decipher it, and sometimes called upon to decipher it myself. I couldn't. That's how bad my writing is. So I don't think many people...
Should have been a doctor, you know.
Yeah, I should have been a doctor.
We're full of them, yeah.
I don't think many people actually realise that wash in the inside of the front cover is the misogyny speech notes. They're probably sort of thinking, oh, it's a very strange hieroglyphic kind of design.
And when you'd finished, I mean, I watched that video, there's this kind of shuffling of papers and certain uncomfortableness that you can see on the other side, but were you aware of the reaction? I mean, did the reaction come immediately, or did it just slowly build up?
I mean, I was aware that it had landed forcefully in the chamber.
Right.
I could tell that. And I mean, I think it's... I'd always kind of make this point that it's... Because women talk to me about, I could never give a speech like that. And half the time I'm like, just as well, because if you started speaking like that on the bus or a train or in the foyer of your office or in the canteen of the hospital where you work, like, people would be reacting pretty oddly. This is a stylised set of behaviours that come with being in politics in the House of Representatives. And, I mean, the speech was sort of the work of a moment, but... being able to stand my ground in that kind of political theatre was the honing of skill over many years. I mean, I couldn't have given that speech the first day I walked into the Parliament. You get more used to it, you get better at it. It's important to get better at it if you want to come through to senior leadership. You've got to be able to kind of, command the space. And so I knew from that it had landed forcefully in the chamber, but had no insight that it would reverberate, and we'd still be talking about it all these years later.
Well, yes. You're doing a stage show of it.
Yes. So it is the 10th anniversary coming up, and I obviously knew that was going to be a bit of a thing. And so for the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, we're publishing a set of essays on misogyny, which I've edited and added to with my own words. And in Australia, we're sort of bringing a version of that to stage in Melbourne and Sydney. It'll have light and shade. It won't be a heavy night.
No, I'm sure. So the book will be available. All proceeds go to the Global
Institute and the stage show.
You've had your orders,
folks,
about that. Yeah, I noticed here that the National Security Advisor in the US for Obama said that Obama and his team used to watch a recording whenever they were getting annoyed with Tony Abbott. So it must have been watched a lot. Did you know that?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Yeah.
No, Ben Rhodes said that on when he was touring Australia.
Oh, right.
So, yeah.
Okay, good, excellent. Now, I promised you we're going to switch now a little bit, and I'll tell you what, we're going to move away from Australian politics in a minute. So, I know you're all Aussies, aren't you? I mean, this place is full of bloody Aussies. No, you're not all Aussies. Okay, but we'll break for a few questions, and we're going to then move away from Australian politics and things like that. But first, I'm just going to ask you one question, which I see if you worked out. But the connection between King's College London, Tony Abbott, and you. Now, the connection with King's College London and you is very clear. But how does Tony Abbott fit into that? Yeah, okay.
Well, no, I can certainly say he's not a researcher at the Global
Institute
for Women's Leadership.
No.
So, no, I don't know what his connection is.
It's actually about being born. He was born at the Lambeth Lying In Hospital, which is now part of King's College London. There's a...
right.
Great, I've got one question you didn't... Okay. So let's take
That's good research. Good
research. Yeah, I know. I'm really pleased about that. Yeah. So, yeah. And could you say who you are?
Yeah, my name is John Catt. I'm obviously Australian.
Yeah.
So I've been living in the UK for 25 years now, and one of politics. And I guess my question to Julia is really, given her time in Australian politics, how she sees Australian politics evolving in terms of diversity. Because some of the stories I've heard sound like, apart from misogyny, it's just sort of prejudice to diversity and difference. And I'm kind of interested to understand what your view is on that.
Yeah, I do. I do think it's changing, and I think in some ways we took on the arguments around gender a long time ago. I'm of that era of Labor politicians that, under the leadership of Joan Kirner, who was the first woman to lead the state of Victoria, she was Premier of Victoria. Under her leadership, fought for an affirmative action rule and Emily's List, which is a funding and support organisation for Labor women candidates. And so that moved, when Emily's List started, the number of women in Parliament from the Labor Party was, 14%. Now, when you look at the National Parliament and right around the state parliaments, Labor is fielding basically a team that's half-half. So that does show you that change is possible. And change has, come in a number of ways in terms of other forms of diversity. I mean, the fact that, we've both under the Conservative government and now under Anthony Albanese's government, that the Minister for Indigenous Affairs is an Indigenous Australian. There are many MPs now from multicultural backgrounds. The Parliament looks a bit more like the Australian population than it used to, but it's not a done deal. You've got to keep talking about and shining a light on areas where groups are underrepresented and putting the case for diversity and how it's fundamental to a democracy, I think, that people can look at the chamber of those they vote for and see the face of the nation reflected. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, right at the back.
Thank you. Melissa Jogi, a researcher at the University of Northampton, also Australian.
Really? Okay.
My question is, recently, as a young woman, and not so young anymore, being a leader, I wanted to ask about, recently the Finnish Prime Minister came out in the news, this balance between being a female leader, that you've encountered a lot of backlash in terms of the general things, motherhood and whatnot, sexuality and being a woman out there. I mean, where are the lines right now for female leaders that you absolutely can't cross, or we're just not there yet as a society?
I think one of the heartening things here is the evidence shows, and this is something that we very much looked at. I co-authored a book on women and leadership with a great friend of mine, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. There we have it, thank you, who was the finance minister in Nigeria, but now leads the World Trade Organisation, which is not an easy job. We interviewed women political leaders around the world, and what we certainly found is the more a nation has women lead it, the more space that woman has. So, we talked to Jacinda Ardern, who is the third woman to lead her nation, and she was kind of crystal clear. The question in her mind, the question in the mind of the New Zealand voting public was not, can a woman do this? That question had been asked and answered when Jenny Shipley had been the first woman to lead New Zealand, and then Helen Clark had led it for a decade. That question was done. And because that question was asked and answered, that meant that she could be sort of imaginative and creative around her style of leadership, so wanting to put kindness at the foreground. But she understood, had she been the first woman leader, that there would have been more constraints. And, someone coming through to be the first woman leader of their nation, where that question, can a woman do it, is still, it mightn't be articulated like that, but it's still in people's minds. If a woman leader in those circumstances came along and said, I want to put kindness at the centre of my leadership, people would be thinking, she's not strong enough for this. You imagine in a US presidential election, given, you know, America is still the custodian of the, you know, most sophisticated fighting machine the world has ever known in the US military. You imagine a woman saying, make me commander-in-chief, but what I want to do is put kindness at the centre of my leadership. People are going, oh, it's a pretty cruel world, and I'm not sure that's going to cut it. So, you know, the more that you know, get women leaders, I think the more these lines that you refer to fall away. So in some ways that then challenges us to how can we accelerate the rate of change and the number of women coming through, and that is the work of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. I mean, the UK now has joined the very elite club of nations that have had 3 women lead them. The only other 2 members of that club are New Zealand and Finland. So, and if you know, pull up, you know, the UN list at any, you know, there's about 190 nations in the United Nations. It obviously changes because elections come and go, but if you pull it out most times and look at how many women are leading nations, it'll come up at a statistic under 20 out of the best part of 200. So we've still got a lot to do to make women's leadership just, you know, usual, normal, and therefore get more of this space that you're seeking, and rightly seeking.
Very good for the prop, by the way. Very good.
Yeah,
Very
well done.
impressed.
Well
done. Well done. Lady at the front.
Yes, my name's Jenny Vaughan. One of the reasons when I was particularly inspired by the speech that you gave, and the fact that you became Prime Minister, is the courage that you showed with so many of the things that were thrown at you and the way you dealt with it. I'm not an Australian, but I love the country, having visited it several times. It might appear slightly off topic, but it is the existential crisis that's facing us at the moment, and that is climate change. Australia is obviously experiencing the negative effect of climate change in what appears to be a more extreme way than many of the other nations, simply because of extremism. I just wonder whether and I just wonder whether you think, with the stage changing in diversity and bringing more women leaders through and taking brave decisions, what is our future there and Australia's leadership in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, with the change of government at the last election, the incoming Labor government has got a far more progressive set of policies on climate change than the government before it. I mean, this, in some ways, in an audience, though half this audience is obviously Australian, but thank you to the
At least,
thank you to the people from the UK who've come as well. You know, I mean, a very different feature of politics here has been that the conservative side of politics has been prepared to embrace climate action. Now, I know people can be a bit sceptical about where that's going next, but, you know, I mean, Boris Johnson with the climate change talks last year with COP in Glasgow, obviously they were leaning into climate action. Whereas in Australia and in the United States, whether or not you're pro-climate action has been a highly partisan issue. And, you know, that does mean the swings and roundabouts of politics either take you forwards or take you back. You know, I am hopeful that one of the lessons from the last election that will be received by all political parties is that the community in Australia is much more minded to see climate action now, and so we'll be moving to a different stage where it's not as sharply partisan as it's been in the past.
Especially because we've had a third of Pakistan underwater.
Yeah.
An action that needed to be taken there with poorer countries who were suffering greater effects. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll take one more question at this part. So, gentleman at the front, catch my eye.
My name's Chris Naylor. I'm a retired consultant and obstetrician. Thank you very much for coming and showing yourself to us. My question is about hubris. Hubris is a risk to patients' welfare and also the welfare of the consultants looking after them. How does it affect you in politics?
I think the Australian political culture is very flattening of anybody who is showing hubris is, you know, we have a culture, we talk about, you know, cutting down tall poppies and that sort of stuff. Anybody in Australia that presents with too much sort of arrogance, hubris, swagger will get a very, you know, very visceral reaction. So, you know, if anything, the essence of Australian politics is to appear to be as ordinary as possible, not to appear to be as extraordinary as possible. I think, you know, different nations and different political cultures. I mean, yeah, obviously the sort of veneration that goes with a US president, you know, there's much more a culture of putting a leader on a pedestal. Here, I think, is sort of halfway in between that kind of very, you know, on a pedestal culture in the US and our very larrikin, egalitarian kind of culture. But, you know, in this world where the problems that politics is trying to solve are such complex problems, it's a bad era to just think, I know and I'm the only one who knows, and that there's not wisdom and new ideas and new energy to be collected from a team. And I'd be hopeful most people wouldn't make that error.
Well, okay, good luck. Okay. Now then, let's go a bit back to the beginning, because you, a couple of weeks ago, I think, received an honorary degree from Cardiff University, and of course you are actually Welsh.
I am.
Well, yes. I was about to say, how did that come about? But actually, that's not quite the right question, is it? But you're from Barry, which I think we all know for only one or two things, don't we? Yeah, I think we do. But so, just tell me a little bit about your parents. It's very obvious that they had you don't need to be a psychiatrist, which I am, but you don't need to be one to know they had a massive influence on you.
Yeah, so I was born in Wales, was born in Barry, but you know my life experience is an Australian experience.
Course, yeah.
We migrated when I was 4 and my sister was 7, so I don't have any original memories of Wales. My sister's got some, you know, because she had started school and stuff, so she's got some memories of Wales. I don't. And you know, my parents, you know, very Welsh, wanted us to understand where we'd come from and understand things about the Welsh culture. My father was from a coal mining village called Cwmgrach in the valleys in South Wales. My mother from Barry, and neither of them had finished high school. They both went on, you know, during their lives to my father in particular, after we migrated to Australia, studied to become a psychiatric nurse. But they were both very conscious that their own backgrounds had meant that they hadn't been able to go through education to the limits of their capability. In kinder times, they certainly would have finished high school. I think they both probably would have gone on to university, but that was denied them. And so they were very focused on my sister and my education. They certainly never taught us to think about limiting ourselves. And I think with 2 girls in the family, you know, there wasn't any sort of gender stereotyping. If, you know, if there had been a son, maybe it might have been a bit more visible, but, you know, their outlook was, you know, you should think big about your career, you should study hard, you should aim to go to university, you should, you know, want to, you know, they wouldn't have used the terminology social mobility, but you should want to push through and get as high as you can. And so, I mean, all of those things stayed with me throughout my life, and particularly, they're with me now, and particularly the difference that opportunity and disadvantage cruelly make in family circumstances. So, you know, my parents migrated, they migrated to a great country, they happened to buy a family home in the zone school district of one of Adelaide's best government schools. If they'd picked a home in another suburb, I might have gone to a not good government school. If I'd gone to a not good school, the whole of my life could have been different. And so, you know, that sense that there's so much of a raffle about this, about who gets chances and who doesn't, and so much embedded disadvantage has been something that's propelled me along in politics.
You mentioned your father was a psychiatric nurse, and obviously I know there's recognised people in the audience are also psychiatrists, and he had an influence. But you also came a bit under the influence of Izzy Pulofsky and his daughter, who I know you know, Lynn Pulofsky, the Maudsley, who tragically died very young. But just almost for our benefit, just mention a little bit about the Pulofsky family.
Sure. So because I just went to the local government schools, and because they were zoned, you had to go to the one in your area. You know, you basically went on a journey from infant school to primary school to high school, and there were lots of the same kids that, you know, obviously some moved and came and went, but there was a kind of cohort of kids that did the whole journey. And after they moved from South Africa to Adelaide, the Pulofsky family settled not far from where my family home was, and so Lynn and Kathy, their older brother Paul, their younger sister, they were all in the same schools. And because Lynn and Kathy, my age, but they were twins, the, you know, educational doctrine at the time, I don't know whether it's the same now, but the school didn't think it was a good thing to have them in the same class. And so that meant as I went through my school, almost always I would either have Lynn or I would have Kathy in my class. And we were just great friends, and consequently I was often around at their family home, they were often around at my family home, and so I got to know their father, Izzy. I got to know their mother, Marlene, very well, and they were influences on me. Certainly, same kind of messages from my, as were in my family home, but very strong focus on education and career and what you can do with it. And of course, my father knew Professor Pulofsky because he was such a noted name in psychiatry.
So we must ask you to come down to the Mausoleum. We'll show you Lynn's portrait and the room in her honour. Can we do that?
Yeah, that
okay,
would be
we'd
lovely.
Like to. Okay. And you, when you became Prime Minister, you I think were the first to make a major thing of mental health. Do you think, was that a political decision or a personal decision, or to do with your background, or with a...
I think to do with my background, I was Shadow Minister for Health for a period, and we presented in that election campaign. We weren't elected in that campaign, but we presented the first mental health policy, and happily at a national level. Happily, since then, and I'm not saying that because of the policy. I think it's a vast range of things, but now in Australia, focusing on mental health has been bipartisan politics for quite a long time. And one of the things that very much struck me about the pandemic, I think it's true here and certainly true in Australia, is, you know, almost at the same time that we were getting the public health messages about what we should be doing to safeguard our physical health, we were getting the public health messages about what we should be doing to safeguard our mental health during long lockdowns. And I think if, you know, we'd had a pandemic 20 years earlier, you would not have had that focus on mental health. I think it's much more mainstream now from governments, from the community, people's preparedness to talk about their own struggles, to have deep conversations with others about how they're going. I think we're a very changed society, and it's a good thing.
A question I always wanted to ask a senior politician about this is actually, though, what is the role of government and politics in mental health? I mean, there's one view is the best way is to, the government's job is to, you know, get good schools, is to keep crime off the street, to give people jobs, and that will lead to better mental health, which is unmistakably true. But what do you think that's all the government should do, or it should actually somehow, be measuring our mental health as an outcome as opposed to GDP or number of children in education? And I think, it go too far?
Yeah, no, I don't think it can go too far. I currently chair Australia's major mental health charity called Beyond Blue, and you know, what we would talk about at Beyond Blue and what the mental health community would talk about is absolutely government's got responsibility in what we would refer to as the social determinants of mental health. So the things that you've pointed to, combating homelessness, drug and alcohol policy, all of these things make a difference. And then in Australia there's shared service provision. So the federal government does fund some things in the healthcare sector for people who are experiencing mental ill health. State governments fund some things, but there's a need to bring those things together. There's not a good articulated sort of pathway. You know, if you viewed it as a sort of continuum of care, there are sort of steps missing at various points just because of the way the federal and state funding doesn't quite come together the way that it should. So we've been on an advocacy journey about that. But I think the government also supporting, I don't think it necessarily has to be at the forefront of this, but supporting the dialogue about mental health, that, you know, people should talk about it, that it shouldn't be associated with shame and stigma. I think that is really important. I think it's probably quite hard to get a good measure though, because I mean, one of the things I mean, the very fact that we are destigmatising mental health means more people will come forward and self-identify and potentially get a clinical diagnosis that they have an anxiety condition or a depressive condition. So a simple snapshot of are those things going up or down, I think it's too complicated for that.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I mean, I feel happier when Chelsea win. But that's not a thing for governments, you know. But
I don't think Chelsea, making Chelsea win is something that the government can do, no, or should do.
No, I agree. Well, I disagree with that completely.
Oh, right.
Okay. So then your time in government, I mean, it comes to a fairly abrupt end, and I just wanted to explain it. You called in June 2013, and you have to explain what this is. You called for a leadership spill. And I've never heard that word.
It's a common word in Australian politics. I mean, it means that you declare the leadership vacant and have a new vote. And back then, it's different now, but back then, who would lead the Labor Party was determined solely by the members of Parliament.
Right.
Yeah. So there wasn't a system like we've just been through here with Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. It wasn't like that.
No, I mean, I was about to say that you started the day as Prime Minister. You said that if you lost, you would leave politics, and by the evening, you'd left politics. Any lessons for us there, do you think?
Well, it wasn't quite as sharp as that. I did start the day Prime Minister and end the day not Prime Minister. That's certainly true. I exited politics at the next election, which happened, not that long afterwards, and I didn't recontest. And I had always been clear in my own mind that whenever the journey came to an end as Prime Minister, that would be my time to step out of politics. And I think that's, been the best, for me. It's given me the opportunity to do new things and learn about new things, use skills that I gathered in politics in different ways. But, people make their own decisions. I wouldn't put it as sharply as saying there's one decision that's always right and one decision that's always wrong. I mean, Theresa May, for example, has stayed in politics here and I think is continuing to make a contribution. What I think, gets destructive is if someone who's been at the top of politics is then still in the system but is, treating it negatively. So I think, individuals need to make their own choices, and I was very clear about the one I made.
And you kept your word. Yeah, so you're now, in the world of addiction, we talk about recovering. We never talk about people cured. We always talk about they're recovering, so you're recovering from politics. Is that a fair thing? Do you miss it?
Oh, yeah.
You do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not every bit of it.
That would be weird.
Yeah, that would be weird. And I'm very conscious when I talk about, and I talk frequently about gender and politics, and then you've got to be very careful you don't leave women in particular with a message that this is so hard, so tough, so gruelling, so difficult that people shouldn't put themselves forward for it. I mean, it's a privilege to serve you. I genuinely believe there are other ways of putting your values into action other than being involved in politics, but there are few other ways that are more effective than being in politics. You know, you get to make big decisions and bring big changes which accord with your values. When Ngozi and I were out on tour speaking about the book, she would very frequently say when she was finance minister, she got to put in place a program which lifted 2 million women subsistence farmers out of poverty. And she would challenge the crowd and say, who wouldn't want to do that? Like, who wouldn't want to do that with their life's time if you could improve the chances of 2 million women? And that's what politics gives you, the ability to do things like that. And so, you know, yes, I miss that. I miss that power for change. At a personal level, I don't miss I still work very hard, but I don't miss the sheer relentlessness of it. Yeah. And I certainly don't miss the sort of media intrusion into, you know, family questions, private life questions, which sort of comes, unfortunately, with the terrain.
So now your current job is maybe not quite as good as politics, but you are the chair of the Wellcome, worth 27 billion quid, of which it disposes of 1.5 billion quid a year without anybody worrying about taxpayers' money, no scrutiny, nothing like that. So surely, I mean, come on, that's pretty cool, isn't it?
No, the Wellcome Trust, a fabulous organisation. We conduct ourselves as very under scrutiny and very, very transparent about how we make the decisions about where the funding goes, and they're most assuredly not made by me. They're made by very transparent, peer-reviewed processes. But a thing that the Wellcome Trust is seized with now under our new strategy, you know, Wellcome has been globalising, and whilst we're still very much in the business of supporting discovery science, so curiosity-driven science that can, you know, bust us through the frontiers of current knowledge into a new place, we have also identified 3 challenge areas that we intend to very strongly support. One is infectious diseases, because that's been a long-term strength of Wellcome, and in this world, of course. One is mental health.
It is,
because,
very good.
Yeah, the burden of disease in the contemporary world, and we need to know far more about how to best address it. And it comes back to your question, one is the intersection between climate change and health. And so they're our contemporary priorities, and I think will take us in some already are taking us in some novel directions with new funding calls where the best of science around the world from very diverse scientific communities is coming together.
Now, I asked your chief exec for what questions should I ask you.
Right.
Okay. And Jeremy said this, he said that when a lot of us in this room were growing up, life was at least much more predictable than it is now. And now, you know, we've got, as you mentioned, climate change. We've got we never had a pandemic, well, at least not in the places we grew up in. We're now facing war on our borders almost, and we're facing a massive inflation that we haven't had for 30 years. You know, it used to be warm in the summer and cold in the winter, and that's all changing. And he said, what do you think of philanthropic, and I think he was interested in the word philanthropic organisation, not a government organisation. What role should it be playing in these wider issues, if any?
I think philanthropy can do some things that government cannot. One, we can show a greater appetite for risk.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, we are most very focused on not being foolish with Wellcome funds, but, you know, because we have our own money, we could make a big bet on a new vaccine for a condition like, say, tuberculosis. We could make a big bet on a new vaccine, and if it came home, then we'd help save millions of lives around the world. If it didn't come home, then, you know, it still wasn't a silly thing to do. It was an important thing to do. Governments find those kind of big bets hard because of the way, you know, people scrutinise taxpayer dollars. So I think a greater appetite for risk. and I think a greater ability in some ways to seamlessly move from science to advocacy and the interconnection between the two. And governments, not in the pandemic era, I think governments did that fairly well, but often governments find that hard. You know, scientists might come up with something that is truly transformative, but governments find it difficult to then join the dots to how that gets translated into clinical practice, to join the dots as to how that gets translated into community understanding. And I think philanthropy, marrying the science with advocacy, can help those processes.
Okay. Good, we'll watch this and see.
Yeah, that's right. I'll see what score I get out of 10 from Jeremy.
I remember, I mean, when I started out in epidemiology, it was a very famous example of Mrs. Thatcher blocked a major study of sex in the UK. And it was an MRC study, and she just said it can't go ahead. You can't ask people questions about their sex lives. And the Wellcome took it over.
Right.
And it made the career of Anne Johnson, all sorts of very famous people.
Yes.
So they did. That was a risk thing they would do. Okay. We'll have one more round of questions in a sec. But then I've got one last question for you, which is really you are very now. Cut that out of the tape, please. You're a truly global person. You almost commute from Adelaide to London. You're obviously well known on Qantas, I assume. You must have your own seat, mustn't you? Or something,
It's a long commute.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it'll probably go bust if you stop. But anyway, but it's this thing that we've been thinking a lot in this country, really as a result of Brexit. Actually, this idea. Theresa May, famously said, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And I think that was her quote, wasn't it? And David Goodhart, in a better way, expanded it to, that there's this difference between people who are rooted in a specific place in a community, etc., and feel that changing, opposed to people who feel at ease all around the world. And that was one of the reasons that we had our own disaster, as it were. I just wonder where you were on that argument about place being really rooted in a place, as opposed to being the kind of cosmopolitan global person that you are and Wellcome is.
Yeah, I think it can be a bit of a false dichotomy. For everyone, me included, there is no place like home, and home is important to your psychology, to your sense of self, having that, intensity with family, a local area that you know well, every street sign. I'm very fortunate to live near a beach. I know that beach really well. I watch it through, I walk on it, I watch it through its seasons. That kind of local intensity, I think it's in us as human beings to want that. But I think at the same time, whether it's physically travelling, whether it's virtually connecting, whether it's just reading a lot and about what is going on in other parts of the world, I think all of us know in the modern age that something can be happening somewhere that will turn up in some way in your local community. And if you aren't thinking about those global patterns of interconnection, then you're going to be not prepared for a whole lot of things, and you're going to miss so much. And in this age, in which almost all of the issues you've listed are shared global agendas, no matter what place in the world you call home, climate change is going to make a difference for you. No matter what place in the world you call home, the ripple effects from the conflict in the Ukraine is going to be felt in your local economy, energy prices, inflation spikes. Certainly, no matter what place you call home, the pandemic changed your world, and in many parts of the world that haven't had equal access to vaccines, they're still at a very different stage of the pandemic than being able to safely gather in rooms like this as we are now. Inequity, new senses of what it means to treat people fairly and inclusively, and to try and move beyond the old boundaries of sex and race and other forms of stigma. I think these are agendas in many parts of the world, no matter where you call home. So you could live here in London and be grappling with those issues. You could be walking on my beach with me in Adelaide and be grappling with those issues. I think that shared connectedness really matters. And in terms of how we educate kids today, I think we've got to educate them with that sense of their interconnected global citizenship, even whilst the, school oval, the local footy team, the local cricket club, the, local park, the games they play with local kids are, a fundamental building, the fundamental building blocks of their world. I think we can do both.
Do you still have a British passport?
No, you renounce, in order to be eligible to run for Australian politics. This has been a very vexed thing in Australian politics. To be eligible to run for Australian politics, you've got to renounce any other citizenships you hold. So many a long year back, I did have a British passport and I sent it off and renounced my citizenship, and it came back with a big cancelled stamp on it. So
because they want you to run for British politics, that's why.
Not eligible, not a citizen.
Okay, we'll do one more round of questions then. So, gentleman there. Yep.
So I just returned from Australia 3 weeks ago, and I was quite impressed by the progress made by politicians from the Aboriginal sort of groups, and it got me thinking about the disability inequalities that we've managed to create in the Maoris, the Aboriginals and the Africans in the environment of the white populations. And in terms of academic interest, I feel it's not just pure genetics. I think there must be something about the environment that potentially we could actually try and make clearer. And it's very interesting that the Americans have already really shown that good education improves the IQ of the blacks far more than any of the genetics. And I think the Wellcome could perhaps make a very useful contribution by trying to dissect this sort of area.
Yeah, I think, obviously we at the Wellcome Trust are very focused on we say that we're there to help solve the health challenges of all of humanity, and all of humanity has to mean all of humanity, and that means that the research needs to be done by diverse researchers. The communities that research is based in need to be diverse communities, so we take that very seriously, and we're very focused on our equity, diversity and inclusion work and our anti-racism work. More broadly, I think we're all starting to come to a better understanding of what colonialism and dispossession has meant, and how that trauma does impact down generations. And one way I think about this, if an Indigenous woman my age in Australia could have been part of the stolen generations, that is, children who were forcibly taken from their parents. So, my sister and I, the age we are, we could have been, subject to that trauma, taken away, perhaps brought up in institutions that had cruelty, sexual abuse, exploitation very much at their heart. And if that had been our lived experience, my sister has 2 children and 3 grandchildren, then, what kind of parent would she have been to her children? A different one than she was, because her own experience of parenting would have been what it was to be a mother or to live with the care of a father. She would not have had that. She had that in our family home. But if she'd been taken away as an Indigenous child, she would not have had that. So she would have parented her children differently. They may have parented their kids differently, and there we are, you know, cascading down the generations, and the trauma's still there. And so when you know, think about that sweep and that perspective, you know, the challenge that it's putting on all of us to work through questions of identity, anti-racism, and how we, you know, heal that past trauma. It's, you know, if I had the answer, I'd happily share it with you. I do not. But, you know, in Australia, we've done things like apologise for the stolen generations, a formal national apology. There's been resources available to help people trace family, to trace country. There's resources available to support people who are still living with that trauma. And, you know, so much more to do. I'm not suggesting that it's enough. You know, we definitely now do so much more in Australian education. I mean, you know, I'm of the generation that went to school and was, you know, well, there was Captain Cook and then there was Australian history, you know, like we didn't, whereas I'd watch my great niece and great nephew now and what they bring home from school and the deep reflections in it about the long history of Indigenous culture in Australia. It's entirely different. So, you know, these are elements of all of the things that ultimately help make change.
Fair enough. Gentleman right at the back. Oh, leave now.
You don't want to migrate to Australia, do you? No?
I have a two-part question.
Ooh, quick.
The first part is, in the financial services industry, there's a growing body of evidence that says that female portfolio managers actually outperform their male peers. My question to you is, do you feel that that could be translated into politics? Do you think that female leaders are better than male leaders?
Oh, that's a great question. On the first, there's certainly evidence that women politicians tend to be less corrupt than male politicians, and women politicians are more likely to advocate for greater social sector expenditure. So I think that's good. I'm not a person who characterises, you know, I don't think it's about proving women's leadership is better. I think it's about actually digging to what genuinely makes a good leader. And there's a man who serves on our advisory council at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, is an academic called Thomas Chimero Pre-Music, who's written a book, and the title is literally something like why do we keep promoting incompetent men and what can we do about it? And
also well.
Yeah, very, very good to read on train, that kind of thing. And his underlying thesis is we are suckers, for all of us, for thinking that confidence and charisma are correlated with good leadership. But when you actually dig a little bit deeper, confidence and charisma are not correlated with good leadership. Actually, self-doubt, being prepared to ask a question again, being prepared to rely on team rather than thinking you know, these things are better correlated with good leadership. So I think, you know, one thing we can all do, men and women, is try and puncture this mythology and point out what good leadership genuinely is and be aspiring for that. So that would be one thing men can do. Second thing men can do is call it when they see it. Gallingly, the research shows that if a man points out that something sexist has happened, he will be received with greater seriousness than a woman pointing it out, because the woman is seen to potentially have an inherent conflict that she's calling it out because it will be to her advantage, whereas a man is just accepted as calling it out because he thinks it's wrong. So call it out, you'll have a big impact. And number three, I mean, disproportionately, whether it's politics, the business community, technology, news media, the law, and the list goes on, the leadership of these areas in our societies continues to be overwhelmingly male. So if men in those positions are not using the levers of change that they have in their hands for a gender equal future, then the whole thing will be a hell of a lot slower.
I'm just thinking a confident, charismatic leader who couldn't actually do the job. I can't think of anyone. Just can't think of anyone. Gentleman on my left, and introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. My name is Afolabi from Nigeria. My question goes towards how can the women and the girl child benefit from your stance in championing the gender equality? How can they benefit globally and especially in Africa? How can they benefit from your stance?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, I don't think it's so much about my stance as it's about, the sort of inclusive dialogue about gender equality and what that difference that makes. When Ngozi and I worked on the book, one question we wanted to interrogate and ask ourselves is how much of the manifestations of sexism are truly global and how much are culturally and context specific. And so we asked ourselves that question around, we interviewed Ellen Johnson Sirleaf from Liberia, obviously very poor country, country with a very vexed history of civil war. And we interviewed Erna Solberg from Norway, one of the richest and most gender equal countries in the world. And so you, at first instance, say, what can these two women have in common? What can their experience of sexism have in common? Well, obviously not very much because it's just so different. But what we actually found is they said some of the same things about focus on their appearance, focus on family structures, being systematically underestimated, being put through additional tests. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf talked about she's the first woman to lead a nation in Africa, talked about going to the African Union where she's in the leaders meeting. She's there as of right because she's president, but she knows she's not accepted unless she performs well. There's an extra test. And so that kind of convinced us that, the arguments that women like me that we put in forums like this aren't non-translatable in other cultures and contexts. There's a commonality in this fight against sexism that we need to recognise and share. Now, that doesn't mean that the depths of gender inequality aren't different in different places, and obviously a girl in South Sudan who doesn't ever get to go to school is on a very different life pathway, and her gender is counting, for her much more seriously than it counts for a girl born in the United Kingdom who will go to school. So we've got to recognise that, but this global dialogue should be a global dialogue, and we should be working together for change.
And in terms of the future of that girl in the Sudan and her chance of having the kind of career you've had, you've talked about education. What do you think of the kind of health barriers that are preventing women from achieving, full careers as most of us have had?
Yep.
In the health
Well, exactly. I mean, any dimension. I mean, if we look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the things that the world has said every citizen of the world should enjoy by 2030, and we look at the gaps between that promise and where we are, and then you do a gender analysis, it'll be women who are coming out, so access to healthcare, access to education, more likely to live in poverty, more likely as adults to be illiterate, and the list goes on. So yes, taking a gendered lens.
Access to contraception and...
Yeah, taking a gendered lens to all of those dimensions of disadvantage matters.
We'll take one last question. We'll give it to someone who's an Aussie. So keep it.
There's lots of them.
Okay. So, lady, they're there. Yeah.
I'm Aussie. I've got 2 passports.
Oh, shocking.
For 45 years. I'm the president of the Australian Women's Club in London, and I'm also a retired consultant anaesthetist. So as a professional woman working, I'm interested to know what you think about these shortlisted panels or interview panels where women are actually positively discriminated, and so they ensure
I know. I think when the evidence is telling you that there's a systematic bias, then it is appropriate to use strategies to overcome that systematic bias. And so, you know, going back to the Australian Parliament when I talked about the Labor Party and coming from a perspective of, you know, 14% women in the early 1990s, if you'd just done a, you know, run round the power brokers and the leaders in the Labor Party at that point and said, you know, why is it only 14%? They would have said, oh, women don't put themselves forward, you know, we've got all of these, you know, men who have done the things that we ask candidates to do. Oh, you know, like what? Well, you know, number have been trade union officials, and then you look at the trade union movement, it's overwhelmingly male, and you say to yourself, well, you know, oh, this is a pretty rigged game, isn't it? Whereas once we put in an intervention and said there's going to be an affirmative action target and you need to select enough women candidates to meet the target, you know, lo and behold, there were women candidates who could be found, and there is no doubt, you know, absolutely no doubt that the quality of those candidates was such that the Labor Party is a better political party in Australia today than it would have been if we hadn't embraced that diversity. So, you know, I think sort of kind of shocks to the system to get it to rewire so that it is more inclusive are needed, and it's about making sure you've designed them well so that they get the right impact. But I am a big supporter of doing that, because otherwise, you know, and I can, in Australia, I can kind of do the control test for you. The control test is the Conservative Party in Australia, named the Liberal Party, but the Conservative Party. That was around about the same level as Labor back in the 1990s. My recollection is we were 14% and they were 13%. And they haven't used quotas or targets or anything like that. They've had women's networking and mentoring and those sorts of things. And they've, you know, climbed slowly from that 13% to sort of 20-something%, but nowhere near half. And at that rate of change, it will be decades before they get anywhere near half. So the structural intervention did work and did make a difference.
Brilliant. Okay. I mean, it's interesting. We, as of last week, now have 3 women prime ministers, but I think your example shows it's not quantity, it's quality that matters, isn't it? I think we'll all agree with that one. Now, to finish off with then, so you know Ian Hickey, he's a good friend of mine.
Yes, I do.
You do. And so he's just written to me, and he thinks you walk on water. That's fine, but that's not what he wants you to say. He just says, please tell Julia that he's got 4 grown-up daughters, just 4 grown-ups, and he says, you have been their inspiration and role model. And I didn't really understand that till I met you, and now I see exactly what he means.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a privilege to have you.
Thank you.